When it comes to landing a great guest, it's all about asking. That's what today's episode of Evergreen Spotlight is based on, as we feature Peter Zablocki, an award-winning historian and author. He's also a history professor. With his engaging storytelling, Peter illuminates the hidden gems of history, research, and all that goes into making a successful podcast. I'm Julie Holliday. Join me on this episode of Evergreen Spotlight. Peter, let's go ahead and jump into the genesis behind History Shorts and what inspired you to make this podcast.
So my podcast journey really began during COVID initially. I have another podcast with Evergreen called History Teachers Talking. And I started a podcast with my best friend, Tom. We've been childhood best friends. And ultimately, we wanted to do something as at the time we were both history teachers. And we wanted to do something that kind of connected us with our students where we were in lockdown. And we started recording these episodes and we thought like no one was going to listen to them. But then all of a sudden people started listening to them and we're like, oh, wow, we got to like clean this up. And over time, Tom and I kind of shifted a little bit. He went into becoming a principal. I went in full-time teaching at a college level, became a professor. And during that time, I also started writing and became an author. So I've published about 9 books, non-fictional history books. And I also have written countless different articles. And for me, as I'm doing research for my books and for my articles, I always come across things that I'm like, wow, this is really cool. And then, as you probably know, you kind of go into this rabbit hole and you're like, okay, I'm going to learn more about this. And then for me, it became a thing of, okay, is this something that I want to take a year to spend researching to write a book? Or is this something I want to take a month to spend researching to write an article for like the Smithsonian? Or is this something I just really want to tell this tale? You know, and as a professor, oftentimes I get a chance to tell a lot of these stories in class, but it doesn't always fit the curriculum. So for me, it was, man, I really want to share these stories. And I would go down and try to talk to my own kids, my young kids. And they're like, Dad, I really don't care. And I'm like, well, that's not nice. So that kind of left me with this like, well, okay, so I still want to share these stories. And that's kind of how History Shorts came to be. It was, I came across so many of these fun things and I would just write them down in this notebook. And finally, I'm like, all right, I don't have time to pitch all these articles to different magazines. So let's find another outlet in which I could share fun history in a, more or less shorter way, that it's shorter for me to do that research because the episodes are only about 10 minutes, but also it hopefully will, these would be things that I would want to listen to. So hopefully it will interest somebody out there and someone would tune in. And so far, so good.
I think they're really fun, especially in those biteable clips, 10 minutes or less. It's like, wow, I didn't really know that about the Lindbergh baby. There's these different topics that you cover that are just really rich. And so in speaking about your research, I mean, it just seems like you gather so much information. How do you fact check? How is it that you're approaching the research?
Yeah, so I'm really big, just having a history background. I'm a historian. I have 2 degrees in history. So every single episode that I come up with, I purposely make sure that I have the notes of all my sources. So if any of my listeners ever say, hey, you know what, you just did something about the Demolition Man was one of the latest episodes in 1605. I could actually turn to my sources and say, okay, this is what I used to create this episode. And I'm big into books. So I am surrounded, you can't really see it, but I'm surrounded by books. And everywhere we go with my family, I always find an excuse, a thin veil excuse to find some form of a bookstore. So my research really just starts like, well, there's this bookstore. And my wife's like, of course there's a bookstore. There's always a bookstore. And I'm like, I know. But I wind up finding books. And I tend to look at the old historiography on things because I believe that history is very much, a lot of the things that I'm talking about, whether they are forgotten per se, because a lot of history podcasts or shows on YouTube will say forgotten history. And history's not really forgotten. It's all there. It's just you need to look at it, right? For me, is some of these things have been told before. So I thought to myself, well, how can I present this information through different lenses? How can I present this information in a newer, fresher way? And I always compare this to like building something from Legos. If I used to do this exercise as a teacher years ago, where I would give all my students pieces of Legos. They all got the same pieces. And I would tell them to build me a ship. And all of my students would take these pieces and they would build this ship, but every ship was different. And I didn't give them any other direction. So some people not misinterpreted, I should say. They interpreted that as a spaceship, and they built a spaceship. And some people try to do a sailboat as best as you can with Legos. And some people try to do a bigger boat. And ultimately afterwards, I said, all right, so let's share our ships. And we all use the same building blocks. And which is the right and correct ship? And the students are like, well, that one doesn't look like much. But the real answer was they're all the correct ship because they're all a ship. And I think history works the same way. Facts are just building blocks. They're like Lego pieces. And historians kind of come up to them and mold them to give them meaning. George Washington might have crossed some river. Okay, who cares? He crossed a river. That's not a historical fact. It's nothing past really, just a sheer fact. But it becomes history when someone adds meaning to it. Well, he crossed that river because he's going to attack the Hessians and he's going to fight back for the American Revolution. All of a sudden, a storyteller, a historian gave meaning to a fact. And the way I look at it is history is full of facts. But if I could somehow look at these events and take the same Lego pieces that have been taken or traditionally you see on YouTube or anywhere else, and if you could take those Lego pieces and kind of present them in a different way, if I could take the same facts and build a different ship, then I'm probably, I'm hoping that I'm doing what a historian would do, is create meaning to something that normally would just be a bunch of blocks of facts. And that's kind of how I approach on my episodes, this idea of, all right, what do I know about this topic? So I'll take out a book. To kind of go back to the original question, I'll take out a book and I'll be like, all right, so what does this book say about this topic that's written in, 1930s? And then I'll say, okay, what does this book say about this topic that was written in 1950s? I also am bilingual. I speak fluent Polish. So I have the ability to also look at different, specifically European topics from a European standpoint. I could pick up a Polish textbook or a Polish book or a Polish website or even the National Archives in Poland, and I could pull out information as it is viewed by a European versus an American. So the ability for me, the way I like to do my research is, what is the common story and how else can that story be viewed? And that's what I do. I kind of test and look at it from different perspectives.
Amazing. I'm finding in my own journey that storytelling is so important, and really laying that groundwork and taking someone, layer by layer through a story. That's a wonderful tip. I wonder, a lot of our listeners are podcasters or they're aspiring podcasters. And I'm wondering if you have some tips for our podcast listeners out there, or even other ways to approach your content or how it is that you produce. Would love to know what's working for you.
Yeah, so I'm a firm believer also as an author. As an author and a podcaster, it really translates. The two kind of go hand in hand. I always want to write a book or an article that I would want to read. And I think for podcasting, that is very important because I only choose my topics and tell the stories that I would want to hear. So it's not like, oh, you know what, right now this big thing is happening in the news, so let's try to just throw that because maybe I'll get a lot of hits. I don't think of it that way. I think of this as I'm going to tell a story that I would be interested in, that I think I would want to know more about. And somewhere down the line, the current event that might have given me a lot of hits at this point, it would have given me a lot of hits now, but it's not really a meaningful episode in the grand scheme of things. So my number one advice, a few things. One is just do it. I get asked a lot by my students, in college. They're like, well, I want to start a podcast. What do I do? And I always say, just start it. We live in a world where you could just do that. You could get yourself a mic on Amazon if you want. Start small, get a cheaper mic, and just go. You have nothing to lose. And so that's my number one thing. Just put your butt in a chair, or if you rather do the standing, whatever, and just get a mic and go. That's my number one thing. And choose something that you are truly passionate about. And like in this case, I tell stories, but I tell stories that I want to hear. And what's important in that is that, down the line, ultimately, I'm not doing this for clicks, right? I'm not doing this to make tons of money. I think if anybody goes into podcasting to make a lot of money, then maybe they should rethink that and go into something else, right? You have to create something that gives you joy, something that you can be proud of. Every time I come in and I do this episode and I write my little stories, I write my little scripts and I tell these stories, it's kind of like I did the best I could at that point, and it's out of my hands. It's like it's like there's your baby. You set him go. They have to go to college, whatever. I look at it that way. Whatever happens to it, I know that I did the best thing I could, and I did it more so in a way that it's not for attention. It's for kind of I'm going to philosophy and Plato, but Plato used this allegory back in the day. Obviously, back in the day, it's Plato. The doctor does the right thing. The doctor does the right medicine, for the sheer fact of doing good. You don't become a doctor because you want to become famous. You become a doctor because you want to, do the right thing. You want to help, and if you do it right, you will become famous. You don't do it for the fame. You do it for yourself and for the good, for the inner whatever it is. So I do this so I could put out the best possible story I can, so that I could enjoy it if I wanted to listen to myself speak, although it's weird. My voice is still weird to me. But, I kind of put it out there, and don't look at the numbers, guys. Don't worry about that. If you do the best you can, and if you find your calling in a sense, and you get yourself in a groove, you do it for you, and eventually people might start liking it, and that's kind of where you go from it. You can't force anything. You can't make people like something,
Well, Peter, in regards to, really doing the stories that you want to do, that may have led to some not so positive listener feedback. I wonder what you do with the feedback that's positive, and if you've ever gotten a negative review, and what you do with that.
Yeah. You kind of have to have a thick skin when you put yourself out there, right? And I can go, I go back to writing books, and it's almost like you can't see who's giving you feedback. Oftentimes, most of the time, you don't know them. Like if I write a book and it has a review on Amazon and it has 100 reviews, and 5 people hate it, give me a 1. I don't know those people, right? And you have to almost look at it. Take things with a grain of salt and put things in context and perspective. So when I look at feedback, I try to look at it holistically as a whole thing.
Yeah.
Are there going to be people that don't like what I do? Of course. But I'm also not forcing them to like what I do, right? So think of it this way. If you have, 20 reviews, and 2 are 1s and the other 18 are 5s, right? I compare that to sitting in, if I was to sell out an auditorium, because I'm doing a live show, and let's say we look at the percentage, there's 200 people in that auditorium, and I say a joke, and 10 of them don't laugh. They're like, that was terrible. But the other 190 do, right? I don't even know that the 10 are there. It's, to me, they don't exist in a sense, right? So you have to look at it kind of in that perspective, is that some people are not going to like what you do, but look at it holistically. Are you headed in the right direction? Now, if I say a joke and 10 people laugh and 190 don't, then now for me, that's something to think about, right? So I have to then go back and tell myself, all right, well, clearly I'm doing something wrong. So that's when you kind of try to reach out and say, well, let's get some feedback. What am I doing wrong? Is my mic quality not right? Some people maybe try to fall asleep to my podcast, and, my intro music's too loud or my outro music, and I wake them up, like what, because again, that does happen, I guess, so ultimately it's holistically, if it seems like no one really likes what I'm doing, then let's get some positive, feedback. Like let's get some negative feedback even, like what am I doing wrong? But if it's a handful here and there, then again, inconsequential in the grand scheme of things. 10 people in a full auditorium, you don't even notice.
We would love to do a rapid fire question time with you, of just kind of asking you some, we don't want you to think about things too terribly long, but especially in regards to history shorts. So are you ready?
Okay, I'm going to try. Go.
Who would you like to have as a guest, dead or alive, on your show?
Oh, dead or alive, you just threw in a curveball. That messed me up.
Yes, we did.
Okay, alive, I just did. So I had Dan Carlin on my show. And he's an absolute hero of mine when it comes to history podcasts. And that's one of the things I should kind of go back a little quick to the question you asked before about people that want to be podcasters. Honestly, we have nothing to lose but ask. I literally reached out to Dan Carlin and I said, hey, you know what? I'm doing this podcast. Can you check it out? See if you like any of these episodes and let me know what you think. And then he literally got back to me and he was like, I like it. I could come on your podcast. And I was like, what? Like, I didn't even think of asking, So Just reach out. I guess that's my key thing. Just reach out. So Dan Carlin would probably be my live person. Someone that has gone, oh my goodness, Winston Churchill. I don't know why, but I just feel like he's an interesting character, and it would be something that I would not mind sitting down and having a conversation with him.
And I wonder what he thinks about John Lithgow playing him, in a recent rendition.
That could be good, right? That could be good.
Of him, yes. And what is a common mistake that you find many podcasters are making?
Some people that I know that have started podcasts go right into trying to turn it into a business. A podcast it should be a labor of love, right? And like I said, the views, the listens, the downloads that will come. So some common things that I see, even from people that are friends of mine, is they'll start a podcast, and the next episode they're already like, all right, here's my Patreon, here's how you could donate money. You could do advertising on our podcast, and I'm like, you have like 7 listeners. Like, why would anyone pay to? They could talk to 7 people on the street just by walking out of their apartment. So the common thing I would say pitfall would be you monetize too quickly. It's not, that should not be the goal. That would be, obviously that's eventually what we all would want, but don't start with monetizing. If you are trying to tell somebody about your podcast on social media, don't just bombard them with, here's my new episode, here's my new episode, here's my new episode, because now you're just selling things, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that if you do join any form of groups that are like-minded to what your podcast is about on social media, be an actual participant in those groups. Do like other things, do share other people's things, do comment on stuff. You're not just there to promote, because then you just become a salesperson, and no one wants that. Be genuine. Like, hey, I do this podcast. It would be cool if you guys like what I do, but I also like what you do. And I think maybe together we could be one happy history family kind of thing.
How many hours does it take you to put together an episode?
Okay, so the episode is for 10 minutes. It probably takes me about 30 minutes to gather my information all together. And that's already because I have most of the sources I have here. Sure. So you figure 30 minutes to gather it, then it'll probably takes me another 20 to 30 minutes to write it. So we're an hour in, and then it takes me 10 minutes to record it. Well, like 15 minutes to record it. So that we're by the time I edit all my ums out, it's crazy. 10 minutes is probably an hour, a little over an hour. And it's a daily podcast, so you could start adding that. It's a lot. But again, I don't look at it as a job. I look at it as I generally am excited to tell these stories. And sometimes, like I said, I'll run downstairs and I'll be like, "Hey guys," and my 12-year-old would be like, "That's great, Dad. That's great." And I'm like, "Okay, that's awesome."
No, you're making a legacy for them,
Shut
I'm sure.
Down. I know.
Yeah, it sounds just about right. I have some teenagers in the house too. Yeah. Sounds just about right.
So funny.
What's been an effective way for you to promote your podcast?
So promotion is, and I say this even in my intro as well, is tell your friends. So my thing is, if I ever hear from anybody, "Hey, I listened to an episode you did on blah, blah, blah." I'm like, "Awesome. Did you like it?" Tell your friends. Word of mouth is still very important. I tried various different things to kind of let people know that I even exist, right? Yeah. And the growth has been amazing. I mean, I really only started History Shorts early this year, I think January, right? Something along those lines. So I went from 30 listeners to, thousands of listeners. So it's great. And I haven't really done anything special to have thousands of downloads, each month, which it just kind of happened. But so sometimes it's about going where people are already there that would like what you do, right? So if you just post something on Facebook and you do a paid advertisement on Facebook, and Facebook will say, "Okay, we will get this to the right people," but maybe they're getting it to the right people that like history, but not people that ever listen to podcasts, right? So you almost want to join like-minded groups. You want to surround yourself with people that already listen to history podcasts. As opposed to just joining a history group, join a history podcast group, join a podcast group, if you're doing fitness podcasts, then join fitness groups, but also try to find ones that already like podcasts, right? So look for the people that already like similar stuff to what you do. Don't go into the real world and try to find someone that might like a podcast on your topic. Look for the specific groups that already do that. Don't reinvent the wheel, I guess would be my number one advice.
Great advice. Love that.
And guests too. If you want any guests on your podcast, just honestly, if you ever going back to like the whole Dan Carlin thing, I've interviewed multiple Pulitzer Prize winning historians. I've interviewed Medal of Honor recipients. I just spoke to the archivist of the United States, literally in Washington, D.C. last week. She was just appointed by the president last year. And I just reached out and I was like, hey, you're like the American historian. Can we talk? And she's like, all right, I'll check out your podcast. And then she got back to me, Dr. Shogun, amazing. So here I am talking to someone in Washington, D.C., the historian of America, and I'm like, this is just me. And that's the beauty of it is, you never know. Just ask. Literally, you have the worst that could happen is you'll get a no, or actually you might not get anything back, right? But all it takes is for one person. There's Adam Grant wrote a book a few years back, givers, takers, and matchers. I think it's just Give and Take is the name of the book. And he kind of divides people. Some are givers, some are takers, some are matchers. It's kind of very reflective. You start thinking about yourself, right? Which one do you fit into? But, for the most part, people are givers. And if you reach out, like I reached out, my first one, I reached out to someone whose book I was reading at the time. That was my first conversation for the history shorts. And I was like reading the book and I'm like, I love this book. I'm like, I wonder what made this guy write this book. So I just Googled this person and he got to his website, click on the contact thing, filled it out. I'm like, hey, I have this podcast. I just read your book. I thought it was fascinating. I would love to talk to you about it. And then he got back to me and said, sure, give me some times. And I was like, whoa, this is like real, So from that point forward, I was like, all right, maybe I could actually do that, right? So I was talking about Medal of Honor stuff, and I wrote a book about actually Medal of Honor recipients from the state of New Jersey, where I'm from. So I wrote a book. It got published, and I wrote it, and I looked at it, and there's only one guy that still is living Medal of Honor recipient from New Jersey. I was like, well, maybe I could like reach out to him. And I was like, hey, I just wrote about you in my book. And he's like, yeah, I'll come on your podcast. I'm like, all right. And you know what? Once you start having guests and you do the right thing and you do it right, then it kind of builds up a certain, not pedigree, that's the wrong word. I think just a portfolio,
like clout,
really.
Almost.
Clout, yeah, almost. It's
portfolio,
like,
yeah.
Yeah, like I've spoken to this and this and this person. And I was wondering if you want to talk to me. And you'll notice if you are in a certain genre, a lot of these people know each other, right? Mm. So if you're in like true crime podcast and you start talking to different people that would deal with that, I'm sure they all kind of know each other or of each other. And it's the same thing in the history realm. When I talk to Bill Brands, H.W. Brands, two-time Pulitzer Prize winning runner-up, actually, a very known historian. So I'm talking to him and he's like, oh, you should talk to my friend Larson. He's really good. And I was like, Larson? I was like, oh, the Pulitzer Prize winning Larson. Okay, cool. So, it's like they all know each other,
Right. Right.
And it just becomes about networking. And now my problem now, an issue is that History Shorts is every day is these quick episodes, right? Which actually take much longer to make than they are. But I have these quick episodes. And then every Friday I have a conversation with some form of historical conversation with a history personality. I am now having people reach out to me to be on my podcast. So now all of a sudden I'm like, yeah, totally. I would love to interview you, but you won't go on until November 1st, and like, that's the problem. So like now all my guests that I have right now, I have about 6 or 7 pre-recorded already. So I'm already in November. So now someone just reached out to me. They're like, hey, I would love to be on your podcast. And I was like, oh, best-selling New York author. This is awesome. Thanks. But you're looking at December 1st because we could record now, but so that has become a problem, right? And so it's a great problem to have. It's amazing. And I'm so blessed that I get to talk to so many people that deal with this or in the same realm that what I'm into. But it's almost like, well, do I start doing 2 interviews a week? Like what's happening? But again, I'm loving it. I'm having a blast. And as long as you don't go into it, hey, this is a business. No, it's got to be a labor of love. It's got to be something that you put out that you could be proud of and then just hope for the best.
Peter, this time with you has just been so fruitful. And just to know like that we just need to ask questions. We need to acknowledge like, you know what, like this is what I want to do and I'm going to do it for the right reasons. So just thank you so much for those insights and just those tips. Like they're so juicy. So thank you so much.
No, thank you, Julie. This was amazing. Thank you for having me on.
Absolutely. And to our listeners, you've got to check out History Shorts. And even if you only have 10 minutes of your time, or even if you don't have those 10 minutes, just put it on. You will listen to multiple episodes, I promise you. And you can also check out the other Evergreen podcasts. Go to the website, evergreenpodcast.com, for a plethora of amazing shows to listen to. And until next time, we will see you on the next Evergreen Spotlight.